So we'll start real simple.
I'm Ted. You're Ted.
Nice to meet you again.
Yeah.
This is the second time we're doing this.
I met with you downstairs a couple of years ago.
It was 2018.
5 years ago.
It was
Okay.
5 years ago. Well,
Yeah,
5 years ago.
I remember
this, this fall.
Was the anniversary. This will be 65 years this fall since the plaza opened.
65 years. Let me think.
Yeah, it was 58.
58. Yeah. Because it was just past the 60th anniversary. So yeah 65 years.
But Steinberg's, I remember coming here with my mother. I remember I was 9 in 58, but I can remember coming here with her, and I'd stand on the front of the cart and holding on as she's pushing the cart down the aisle. So that's a memory I have.
I can't even imagine, and this is the hard part about doing, no, not the hard part, but the realization in doing these types of interviews now is you can give me a perspective of the 50s, but it's from a child's perspective.
Yeah.
What's missing is the parents' perspective of going from the smaller stores and what it was like to shop at a Steinberg's.
Because my parents' generation now are mostly gone,
I can't imagine what it must have been
there's probably
incredible.
there must be written documents somewhere. Like I have that copy of that book, 2 copies of that History of Pointe-Claire by Brian somebody.
Brian Matthews.
I have my parents' copy I got back, and I have my own. Those kind
There's
of things.
a little bit, but he didn't. I don't know how many interviews. I don't.
That's
like,
more
you don't see many
that's
quotations.
more of a, in my opinion, that book is more of a historical, chronological account as opposed to an average day-to-day.
history,
Yeah.
But that's the interesting part, right?
Yeah.
Because the chronological account is embedded in what we're talking about. So you moved in 56.
56, May 1st, we moved to
And
Pointe-Claire.
Where were you living before that?
Ottawa.
Oh, Ottawa.
Yeah. My parents are both from the Ottawa area. Ottawa. My dad was from downtown. My mom was from a little town called Carp, just west of Ottawa.
Carp?
Carp. C-A-R-P. Yeah.
Okay.
Still there.
It's
And my
it's still
yeah.
there.
Well, I have an old cousin who lives there.
Still there.
Yeah. Well, not in the town itself, but my grandparents lived up in the town when I was born. Before that, they lived on a farm where my mother was born in the farmhouse that her parents were the farmers, and then in the war, my grandparents moved into this town of Carp, and my uncle, their older son, became the farmer, and so as a kid I went to the farm and played out in the back with my cousins, and so yeah, that's where my mother was, from a little town outside of Ottawa.
So it would have been the city that you were born in?
I was born in
Ottawa?
Montreal. Me, you mean? Or my
Oh, you
parents?
were born in
I was
Montreal.
born in Montreal. My dad was going to McGill at the time.
Oh.
He was living.
He was married? No.
Oh yeah, this is after the war. He was. I can give you, if you're interested. My dad's. He's from Ottawa.
I'm curious to know how. I'm usually. I always ask, when did you move to Pointe-Claire?
Yeah.
And usually that ends up becoming an even more interesting story, because
Yeah.
even
Well.
why you decided to move here, like what led to
Well,
this?
my dad got a job here. He was a doctor. He went to McGill in the early 40s, got a BSc, enlisted in the Air Force right away, and was selected to become a navigation instructor. And he spent 2 years doing that, and then he finally got sent over to England on a boat in early 45.
Early 45.
Yeah, he only went, and I still don't know.
How many months were left?
You know what? I've got his handwritten journals. His boat arrived in Liverpool the week before VE Day, Victory in Europe. And I'm looking back. Years later, I thought, wait a second, why would they send over boatloads of troops when they must have known it was
They must have
almost
had an
over.
idea.
I'll never know the answer to that. So, and luckily he never went into battle. Otherwise, I might not be sitting here having this conversation.
I wonder, do you think he was happy or disappointed?
I don't know. He was a patriot. He went gladly. Anyway, they got my mother and him got married in 43,
Mm-hmm.
and then
In Ottawa.
yeah, he had a week. He graduated in May from McGill, enlisted promptly, sent to boot camp for 3 weeks in Laurentians. Then he was sent to Quebec City, where they to be trained. So they had a weekend off. They had their wedding in Ottawa, and then and my mother ended up moving to Quebec City with him.
So it wasn't conscription.
No, he enlisted. Oh, he enlisted.
So he enlisted, but there was conscription, wasn't there, for World War II?
You know what?
Or did they not have to enforce it, or
There was
something?
university. I took this in university history. Canadian. The prime minister was a guy named Mackenzie King,
Yeah.
William Lyon,
Yeah.
and he was a master of to me, he was what's the word? Negotiator. The election campaign in the early 40s, there was an election, and conscription was the big issue. And apparently one of his quotes was, conscription if necessary, but not
right.
necessarily conscription. In other words,
right.
talking out of both sides of his mouth. So I don't know whether
It's a
conscription
psychological game.
Yeah.
Because
Anyway,
there was for World War One. There had to have been.
I
for
don't
World
remember,
War
I
I.
don't know. There
But
may
it's
have
the
been.
same. But it was also a psychological game for that too, because they were doing a lot of
It was
propaganda
politics.
for World War
Conscription,
One.
and I think part of it was, again, even back then, the Quebec was not on board with, a lot of people didn't want
To fight for the king.
yeah, there was, they won't
Fight for the
call them
Commonwealth,
separatists, but there was still there was a communist party in Quebec back then, there was, so I think the federal election, I don't know whether he won again, whether or not conscription was enacted, I don't know. But it
Well,
was,
everyone who I hear about, it's always enlisting, that they enlisted.
yeah.
I don't hear anybody talk about.
No, it was a different era, different values, in my opinion. People that would fight
Their
for
dads
freedom for our
did-
country. Yeah,
their
my dad
dads
went
did
moving,
it.
and my
Their
mother.
dads, but-
So my parents got married. My older brother was born when my dad was overseas in England in '45. So I always
yeah.
think about, mostly men went to serve and risk their lives and die. In my case, my family, my mother, I can't imagine. She was here for a year as a young mother, wondering whether, I can't imagine the thoughts, the fears, the anxiety about, will he ever come home?
Everything is on hold.
Yeah, she's here with a baby. Is he going to come home?
So were they getting? Now we're off topic, but it's still
Yeah.
interesting. Was she getting some kind of allowance? Like were the women at that time getting some kind
I
of?
don't know. I would doubt it. I think
Like food stamps
She
or
was-
something? Like, how would you feed the kids?
that's a good question.
Because what would they have done? Well, the women would have gone to work, wouldn't they? Didn't they go to
Well, my mother had a
factories and all that
job.
stuff and
When they met, she had a job. She worked in a government office building in Ottawa.
that is if they didn't join the.
But that
enlist
was
too.
before she got married. So after they're married, and then when she got pregnant, and then my dad went over, and he wasn't here when my brother was born. But I don't know whether I know she lived with her parents for a while, and I think downtown Ottawa with her parents-in-law, my dad's parents. I have no idea about. That's a good question. Whether they got any kind of government, even food stamps.
I think where would any of the money come from?
Yeah, I don't know. That's a good. I never thought of that. I mean, food stamps. My dad has stories about in the Depression in the '30s. He had to get food.
So so what did your dad study at McGill?
First, science. He got a BSc in science, and then he promptly enlisted. And
As a what again?
well, he enlisted. He wanted to go. He told me his buddies. He was from a lower, poor area in Ottawa, and his dad worked on the CPR railroad for like 50 years. But he got laid off in the Depression, like no fault of his own, and scrambled for work to feed the family. And my dad, he was very self-conscious. He told me they got food stamps, and my dad was so shy about. He would walk halfway across town to a store that they didn't know who he was to cash in the food stamps, because it was just his personal little.
Even though everyone else is going to the same
Yeah.
part.
So that was part of his motivation to become a doctor. He told me was, he never wanted to have someone that could tell him, "Sorry, you don't have a job." He wanted a profession. That was part of his motivation, and he was also altruistic in wanting to become a doctor and help people.
They made good money at that time as well.
Doctors.
Yeah.
When? Like when my dad was a doctor, or?
Yeah.
I have no idea, but I have another story about that. As far as Medicare in Quebec coming in later
So
on. But
he okay. So do you know how long he was overseas for in the end?
yeah, he went over in
So it was the beginning
April of '45.
Yeah.
Literally arrived, and he plotted the route. This is when they went by train to Halifax, and they weren't given. Everyone on board was not told. They know where they were going, but they weren't told the route they were going to take, because the U-boats. There was an old expression: "Loose lips sink ships." But he was a navigator.
Loose lips sink ships. That's
And
good.
he was a navigator. He made his own fabricated rudimentary sextant, which is how navigators read the stars. That's how they plot. That's how Columbus. That's how they all.
The Egyptians.
Yeah. So anyway, he made his own little handmade sextant. He was interested to plot his route. And a couple days into the trip, when they get, he said, "Okay, tomorrow we should probably be going by the Maldives or the Azores, whatever." Sure enough, the next morning there's landfall. He just did it because he was interested to kind of plot it. So they went to Liverpool, So basically he arrived in England in April 45, and he didn't come back until early 46, because it was first come, first, like, all the guys who had been over there from the beginning got to come home first when the war was over. So he was in the last kind of groups, and he was already accepted. He applied to Harvard and he applied to McGill. He was accepted at McGill, but he couldn't get home in time for that first year. So he came back and re-enlisted in McGill in medicine. At the time he had a son and my mother, and they lived in, when I was born, he was in his last year, third or fourth year of medicine at McGill. And
so he comes home, and then they pack up and come to Montreal.
I think he went to Ottawa Toronto for work for a few months.
Yeah.
Until he was able to come.
School started.
And we lived in Lachine. There was a place called Peterson Residence. It was former military barracks. They had a.
Whereabouts in Lachine is that?
It's gone now. It was there for many years.
Is it where the
just south of the 420, around 32nd? You know, there's a big. So in that area, 25th Avenue, McGill had a thing for returning servicemen who were undergraduates.
Yeah.
If they were married and had families and they'd served, they got to live in these residences. And my mother had a little 1 or 2 year old, and my dad was taking a streetcar up to McGill every day. And so I was born the last year he was there. And my mother, it was a sacrifice. He was studying, and they had apparently a common cafeteria where all the mums and the families ate, and the dads went to McGill. I guess mostly dads, I'm assuming.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where I was born. The year after he graduated, he went back to Ottawa to intern for a year, and then we moved. Then he took a job in northern British Columbia for a year as the only doctor at an RCAF Air Force Base.
So you all moved?
Yeah, that's my first memory. I turned 3 up there. It was a 1-year contract. We flew up to Fort Nelson. It's called a little town up in the Alaska Highway. He was the only doctor for hundreds of miles, literally. And he'd go out in snowshoes to the Indian villages and treated people. And if there was an emergency, they put him on a plane down to Edmonton if it was something he couldn't handle. So this is like part of his training, his experience. And then we moved to North Bay, Ontario for 2 years. He worked in a clinic there.
Where are you going to school?
Where did I go to school?
Where did you start school? North Bay?
No, I was 3 and 4 up there.
Then
we moved back to Ottawa for a year while he interned 1 more year. I went to kindergarten for 1 year, and then he got a job in Montreal working for a drug company I didn't notice till years later, I didn't realize it. For the whole winter of 55 into 56, he was working here 5 days a week. He was driving from Ottawa on the old 1-lane roads on Sunday night. He was boarding with a family in town Mount Royal, and then working Monday to Friday, and then driving home to Ottawa for the weekend. So this couldn't go on forever. So that's when they bought our first home on Fairhaven in Pointe-Claire.
So 55 and 56, the winter of 55, 56?
Yeah.
He was commuting?
Yeah.
And he was working in TMR? No, he was living in TMR.
I think he was working in that part of town over by DeCarry somewhere. It was called Horner's was the name of the drug company. He was their sales rep, basically, going around to all the doctors, selling, like a sales rep.
Right. And so did you ever ask the question, why Pointe-Claire? What was the appeal to Pointe-Claire? Or what would be your guess?
That's a good question. I don't know. My guess is that they did some research, whether other people who lived here said, well, this is a good suburban area for a young family.
Growing, developing, brand new.
I think that they would have had something. They just wouldn't have thrown a dart at a map, Well,
where else would there
I mean, the West Island, even then,
50s?
Was predominantly English. Not so much now, but still. And downtown, there's traditional TMR, Westmount, Montreal West were the other more English as opposed to French.
Yeah.
So that's a good.
Which might be more pricey. Here you probably land versus price is probably better out here.
So
I'd imagine
one thing in my case, after
first person to live in the house, was it a brand new house?
No, it was. There had been a previous owner.
Yeah.
Of a couple of years, I think it might have been the original owner who we bought it from, and it was the first house my parents had owned. And what happened next in our case, my dad was a doctor, but he was working for a company as sales rep. Within a year of us moving here, he discovered that this company was, unbeknownst to him, putting his signature and name on testimonials for some of their products. He quit the company. I didn't, again, I was 7 years old. And he came home and in so many words, and my mother told me this story years later, even maybe after my father was gone. He basically quit and came home, and because this is wrong. And he apparently in so many words said to her, honey, I quit, let's go home, meaning let's sell, let's go home to the Ottawa area. And my mother, in so many words, said, well, can we not stay? He says, we have nice neighbors.
So you're how many years in Pointe-Claire? 1 year in Pointe-Claire.
Well, this would have been within the first year or so.
In the first year of Pointe-Claire.
Yeah.
But 1 year in Pointe-Claire, your brother would have been in...
he would have been 11 or 12, so he was at Cedar Park School, where I went.
And you would have started as well.
Well, we moved here.
Your mother would have met the teachers and the other moms, and proximity-wise, it was good.
Yeah, we moved May 1st, and I went to my last 2 months of grade 1, and then continued. My brother would have been in grade 6 or whatever.
And where in Ottawa were you just before this?
On a street called Woodruff in the West End, which is, we have...
Was it much more developed than Pointe-Claire would have been at that time, or
no? It was similar. It was a big street back then. We were in a duplex, but it was a home, not an apartment. And I went to kindergarten at this. This was in Ottawa. They have a thing called the Queensway, the 417. It runs across Ottawa. I remember as a kid, it was just being built. We used to walk up the end of our street and just kind of like look at and fool around with all the construction. That's when they were building it in the mid 50s, I guess. So anyway, my mom said, can we not stay? It was our first home we've owned. We have nice neighbors, it's a nice neighborhood, there's schools, there's churches. And he said, okay, and he was a medical doctor. He never practiced as a doctor. So he basically put a post in the front lawn. I brought his newspaper clipping from the News Chronicle, Dr. Brennan opening family practice in our home, in our bungalow, for a year or two. And I remember coming home from school, and we had a 3-bedroom bungalow. One of the bedrooms was their bedroom, the other was my brother and I had bunk beds, and the 3rd bedroom was his office. And our neighbor was a handyman. He built a partition in our living room, and they had chairs. So I'd come home from grade 1 or 2 at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, whatever, and there'd be people sitting in our living room in chairs, like reading magazines, like a waiting room, to go down the hall to see Dr. Brennan. But this lasted for like a year or so. And then he rented office space on Pardo with a doctor, Dent. I posted this on Facebook the other day.
Pardo is where again?
Right beside, across from John Rennie, you have all the Pardo apartments.
Yeah.
The first street west of that, off Douglas Shan, is called Pardo. It's a short little street. And the last building home is 88 is the address. And the dentist was Dr. Serge Guroff. And my dad rented part of the office space from him from 1958.
On the west side of St. John's?
Yeah, across the west side of...
And west of the apartments?
Yeah.
That first street
Douglas
parallel
Shan,
to...
yeah, Douglas Shan. The first street runs north-south. It's called Pardo.
Going north from Douglas Shan?
Yes. Yeah, it's only 1 block.
It was a residential home that he converted into a...
Well, the other guy, Dr. Guroff, I assume, owned it was his building, and my dad rented office space from him for 7 years, 6, 7 years. And the office, I drive by it once in a while, there's still some doctor or some professional, because I see I can't make out the name, but so it's still used as a professional office of some kind.
So how long did he practice for?
1956 to 1978. And then he bought his own office building on Oak Ridge in 1965, 108, and it's still there. It's still someone's doctor's. It's right adjacent to the Cedar Park Heights. And at that point, he wanted his own space, and he was able to afford to buy a second. It was a home.
So where would he write his prescriptions to? Where would he send people mostly?
McDermott's. I brought a copy of. He still has on the reverse of one of his. Doctors have their own notepads with their. On the reverse side, I've posted it before. It's McDermott's Pharmacies. It's from the 50s with the Oxford number and 2 locations in Valois and Pointe-Claire or whatever.
Because McDermott's would have only been. Well, let's see. There was a McDermott's here.
Yeah.
It must have been an original. I'm guessing. It was
I think the original was in Valois.
Oh, 52. I think.
In fact, I went over 5 or 6 years ago. I went over because I think he was going to be retiring. He was still there, and I went over and talked to him briefly.
Oh, really?
Had a nice chat, because I remember, that was the main pharmacy, McDermott's. I remember the one in Pointe-Claire shopping here. I never went to the one in Vawa. But I think he was there for almost 70, like 1953 or so, I think, is when he opened his pharmacy until 4, 5, 6 years ago.
Not even 10 years ago. Yeah.
I have a picture. I took it from there was an article on his retiring in the Gazette.
Yeah.
And I have a picture of it. I took a picture in it. But I had a little talk on it. He remembered my dad, and he had very nice things to say. He said, your dad, he said,
send him business.
He said, something like, everybody loved your father, and that made me feel nice.
When did your father pass away?
1986.
86.
On his birthday.
You're kidding. Had he been sick for a while?
2 years. He was, it's hard, you can't go back, you can't, it's not fair, life's not fair, he helped people his whole life as a doctor. Anyway, like he asked, they were finding, we lived on Bathurst down by Stuart Hall. He had his practice, and he got a phone call one day out of the blue from someone he'd gone to medical school with in Kingston, offering him a job. It would end up being he ended up taking it was the head of medical services for all the penitentiaries in the Kingston area, of which there are a lot. And it was a federal civil service job. And I remember coming home and saying, but I remember him also saying, at the time he was just about to turn 60 or so, he was around. And he said, this kind of job offer doesn't come to people when they're 60 years old. And it was a big decision to sell 2 houses. He wanted to find a doctor to look after his patients, take over his practice, which he did. This is a good opportunity, this is the right time. So he went down there, and he built a house, he designed it, he had it built back.
You were already out of the house at that point?
Yeah, I was gone. My brother was downtown, so we were gone. So he basically moved there. He had a house built back on a golf course, and didn't like the job. It was going into penitentiaries where these hardened guys pumping iron, but he was the director of medical services for a bunch of penitentiaries, and there's Millhaven, there's all this, and then going to Ottawa for meetings. It was a civil service job, but it was financially very good. He got because of serving in the war, retroactively he got indexed for extra pension. And my mother, after he died, she was, the last few years, she was in the hospital a few times. She had the best health. She was part of the Public Service of Canada benefits. She inherited, so she had free of charge, covered for private rooms if necessary. So this was what he did. Didn't like the job. He retired when he was 65. I went down. I was married then. They had going away. And within a year, he started to get sick, had tests, they contracted. He got diagnosed with a disease called multiple myeloma, which is a disease of the blood. I call it cancer. And he's a doctor, he knew, and there's no cure, there's no life expectancy is not long. And he declined over 2 years and finally passed away on his birthday.
So most of your memories growing up were in that house, that first house that your parents had, one and only house that your parents had.
A lot of them. We lived there for 7 years. And then we moved to Bathurst in what's called the Priest Farm.
So when you were living in that first house, Priest Farm at that point was still entirely a farm. But weren't they starting to develop a little? Weren't they starting to buy some of it out?
My memory of the timeline, and there was the first street I'll call it I think it was called Marlin Crescent. Like there's Lakeview, and then north of Lakeview is where Fairhaven is one of the streets in there. And then on the other side it's called Medalon, is this across the street. There's the intersection at Lakeview and Medalon. It goes into Fairhaven, and across from that is now Longmore, which leads into the Priest Farm. But the first street in there on the left is called Marlin Crescent, I believe. And my memory is that was the first sub-development, I'll call it, because we used to play, and behind that there was a long, kind of like a little canal, and there was frogs and stuff. We'd go over there and just fool around.
In the Priest Farm?
Yeah, in the physical. But the rest of it, I don't have much memory. It was just, and there was an actual farm at the other end. And I remember the night the Priest Farm caught fire and burned. It was in the paper. A lot of people my age would remember that too. It was a big deal.
Because it was a massive structure, right?
Yeah, it was old, and it caught, I don't know how it caught fire, but it burned almost to the ground. That was the end of the Priest Farm, and they moved somewhere else. And it was on the pictures, there was pictures in the paper the next day. The photographers came out and they took the flames and everything. And we went over and watched some of it. I just remember my mom coming and going, there's a fire at the Priest farm, and we went over and watched. This is 1958, I think, was when that happened.
Yeah. Exactly.
So anyway, by the early 60s, it was now under development, and so my parents bought the house. It's on Bathurst. 1963 we moved in, so it's almost 60 years now. And I remember what my parents paid for their homes. Other people on Facebook will talk about, oh yeah, a car back then was in the 50s was this much, and a loaf of bread. Yeah, well, everything is more expensive. But I remember the bungalow we had on Fairhaven, I think they paid $18,000 for it, roughly, and sold it for like $21,000 or something.
21.
And I think the house on Bathurst, they paid like $34,000 which sounds ludicrous
Within
by
a span
today.
of 6 years.
6 or 7, yeah. And it was a big 2-story, it's a nice house. Well, I've put this on Facebook before. The Woolworths that was originally here, there was a lunch counter. And in the early 60s, when I was 11 or 12, I used to get 50 cents allowance from my parents at the time. And every weekend, my buddy and I, we'd come up there and sit at the soda fountain and have a Coke and a French fry for 25 cents total. Like one was 15 and one was 10. And I'd have a quarter left over for Mad Money, you know.
For Mad Money.
So
Did they sell them in the Woolworths?
Yeah, they had Woolworths original had a lunch counter.
Yeah.
Whatever they call it. Yeah. And we'd
did
sit there.
McDermott's have a soda fountain in the one here?
I think they did.
One?
I think that one here. I don't remember specifically. I didn't.
I hear about people getting.
I think they
stuff.
might have. Yeah. I know that I remember going in there and buying candy and stuff, but not.
Now the Woolworths was exactly where the Uniprix is, right? Is that?
I think roughly, yeah, because the whole thing, it was at the end, is my recollection. It was the last store of the original.
The original end.
And
yeah.
you know, of course, it wasn't covered. It was
Which I think is the end of Uniprix.
Yeah, because there was a gas station at the end.
Yeah.
So I think, in relative terms, I guess that's roughly where it would have been. And they sold records too. And I remember, I might have bought some records there, like my early Beatles stuff. I remember mainly going to Ted's Records, Hobbies every week, and getting the new Beatles and the original issues of the Beatle records, at least, and some other groups too. It was a color picture sleeve with pictures on both sides. And then after that first shipment, then from then on, it was just the picture, the regular white sleeve.
Yeah.
So I still have all those original ones that I got.
Tell me this again. The first run of these singles had
in my recollection, the first shipment of
45.
45s. I know Beatles because I still have a lot of them. And I guess other groups. There's other groups. The Beach Boys. Certain record companies released with I don't know whether it was but my recollection and my understanding is that it was just the first shipment had these color picture sleeves for the Beatles in particular, and then after that was shipped out. The next shipments from the factory just had the regular white paper picture sleeves.
Most of the people I've spoken to were big into sports.
Yeah.
Because I feel that there wasn't much anything else to do but be involved in some kind of sport activity, mostly with the school, because there wasn't much organized sport happening in the West Island in those days. Where did you stand in that? Were you obscure? Were you an artsy kid, or were you a sporty kid? Or
I wasn't really sporty. I skated for a year or two till I was about 12, and then I gave it up. I don't know whether I played on teams or whether I just skated at the rinks with my friends, but I gave it up. I don't have much patience for things. I never have, because I think what it was, you know, when you first learn to skate, apparently you have to get, your ankles have to get developed to be stiffer, so your skates aren't flopping on the side. My ankles, the ankle. And I got frustrated. I thought, screw this. And I literally stopped skating when I was about 12. Gave it up forever.
I gave it up like smoking. I
wasn't a jock. But I used to go to it's like my Maurice Richard autograph I got at we used to be called the Clare Point rink over along west on Lakeview over near towards Cartier, let's say. The park is still there, and they have a skating rink and a tennis track. So that's where I used to skate, as I remember, until I stopped skating. And my older brother Richard, he played, I've got a picture of him, Little League Baseball. He was on a team called the Pointe-Claire Pirates. And I can remember going down, they played at, in the Pointe-Claire Village beside the curling club, there's a lawn bowling.
Yeah, behind the movie theater.
Well, across up the street, like the curling club is on, is it Lanty, I think is the name of the street there?
Yeah.
Just beside it.
That was the Diamond.
Yeah, that's where he played Little League Baseball.
Yeah.
And then they'd go down to a place called Chez Roger,
Yeah.
which was, they get French fries and
I
stuff.
think I posted an advertisement for that.
Yeah, you did. Someone commented, and I think I
Yeah.
might have commented about my brother played
Yeah.
baseball there before.
I found advertisements from the 40s for that
Yeah,
diamond. Was music the main deal in your life when you were a kid?
A big part of my life growing up. Like I said, I've always loved music, listened to radios, and I started buying records and the hit parade, basically. But also my parents' music. I liked musicals. Broadway, like South Pacific. They took me to Pointe-Claire Theatre to see South Pacific, the movie, in 1958. I remember that. And My Fair Lady. And so, yeah, I've always, and I find it ironic, I worked most of my career, I'll call it, in the entertainment industry of different kinds. A lot of it to do with, well, music, rock and roll, like groups, and then I did concert production. So I've always thought, a little ironic, as much as I love music, I never picked up an instrument. And in high school, my buddies like Steve, who ended up in April Wine, a lot of guys at that age, the Beatles, made little bands, and we'd go and watch them, and I just never, I don't know, occurred to me, or I never had the interest or whatever to do that. So I find it a little, considering how much I love music, and it's a big part of my life, I never actually learned to play an instrument.
From a spectator.
And actually, when I was about, in my early, before I was a teen, my parents, they bought an upright piano, and I took lessons for a year at a woman down along Lakeview. And I gave it up after a year. I was just too...
Like the skating.
Because you had to learn the scales, and you had to... I was too impatient. I wanted to get from 0 to 60, like right away.
Yeah.
And to me, I look back, it's a trait. I'm impatient, and they call it the attention span. I just don't have the, like, board games like chess, for example.
Oh, yeah.
I never was interested. I can't sit here and do this and
Monopoly.
watch some guy make a... No.
Monopoly.
Yeah, Monopoly I played a bit. But just, in my case, so I don't have the... I never had the discipline, is another word maybe, to actually apply myself to do something like that.
So you turned to, like, music became your thing, and what did you, like, every weekend you were at Ted's?
In a manner, pretty much, I guess, considering I have all these weekly hit charts for years. Yeah, I'd go up there and get the hit chart, and when the Beatles were, whenever there's a new record or album, I'd be buying it and flipping through the racks and all that. So that's a big memory. And
you were a regular.
Yeah, I love music. I went to concerts. I saw the Beatles 3 times.
So you knew the guy who ended up owning it, Dalton Pratt. He would have been working there in the early 60s.
At Ted's Hobbies, you mean?
Yeah.
No, and I've seen that name and maybe in one of your things about, no, I just remember Ted Bryan, because his son Bill ended up being a drummer in a group called MG and the Escorts, who we used to watch. And then he went to Toronto and ended up in a group called the Parachute Club, and became well known in Toronto. Yeah, so,
Yeah.
and I know that's the original owner of Ted's Hobbies. I don't remember when it was sold or when.
So Dalton Pratt started working for Ted Bryan, 62 or 63, just as a clerk.
Yeah.
But then over the years, he became the purchaser. So he was the guy purchasing all these albums that you ended up buying, right?
Yeah.
And he said a lot of the times he would go and pick them up because a lot of the stuff was being manufactured.
There was no
in Montreal
Amazon
at the
Prime
time.
back then, right?
So he would go and pick up all the albums,
Right.
and then bring them to the store. And so Ted passed away, let's say 71-ish,
Yeah.
72. I can't remember the exact date. He passed away around that time. I think it went to his wife. His wife sold it to Dalton.
Okay.
Dalton had been there for 10 years or
Yeah.
so at the time. Dalton owns it, and then in the mid 80s, Peter Grant started working for him in the mid 80s. This is when RC cars were popular, and they were doing the RC car track in the parking lot.
Yeah, different hobbies were coming along.
Yeah. And just before video games, right? Before video games.
Yeah.
And so Peter worked for him until early mid 2000s, and then he sold it to Peter. So it's kind of...
It's almost like an in-house generational.
Yeah. It's kind of like it's in the family.
Yeah.
You know, the employee who'd worked for the guy for
Yeah.
a decade or so ended up purchasing it off the
So it's
previous
almost
owner.
like 3 generations in a manner of speaking.
That's right. So I became very curious about when I watch documentaries on the Beatles and the Stones and all this. It's always on a grand scale and how they affected
Yeah.
a generation. I'm curious about what the scene was like in the West Island. Like, was there a Stones group and a Beatles group? Was
Well-
there a R&B group? Was there an anti-Beatles, I still like Elvis group? Like, what was it like
Well,
at the time?
My memory is that I knew, friends of friends who formed bands, like a lot of them, garage bands, whatever you want to call them. But they played at local churches, basements, and little rec halls and stuff. And some of them actually got to the point where they released records, or at least had records issued or recorded in some way. But like MG and the Escorts was a West Island band. I have one of their 45s. They became big enough to have a record. I have JB and the Playboys album. They were a big group, but those were recording artists that were better known. In my little milieu in John Rennie, there was several bands, guys I knew who formed bands, and we'd go and see them at someone's house on a Friday night. They'd play, or up on Westcliff, there's a church called, I think it's St. Augustine's Church up there. They used to have a Friday night thing for kids down there. Bands would play there. In Valwa, it's St. Columba by the Lake Church, where I got married. And so we'd go to dances there. At Dorval.
Always live music, always bands, always live music.
Yeah, and I had, like I said, a handful of friends in high school, formed bands. I can remember the names of them. Well, the Attic Dust, the Shambles. They played it. I've got a thing about them on here. Steve Lang was in the Shambles, my friend. That was his first group. He played guitar, and they played at John Rennie Black and Gold Review. They played at high schools. They played in our friend's basement on a Friday night. They opened for Jay and the Americans at the Pointe-Claire Arena that I saw.
So would you say that there was a distinct reaction to what happened in '64 compared to the amount of bands that existed pre-'64?
Oh yeah, I don't think there were many bands pre-'60. There was a couple of, again at John Rennie, there was a couple of friends of mine whose older brothers were in a folk group, because in the early '60s, folk hootenanny was...
Yeah. Rock and roll was
Peter, Paul and Mary, all this stuff, there was that movement.
At that point,
and the civil rights movement, there was a lot of them were...
Yeah, it was more intellectual.
And then the Beatles happened on Ed Sullivan, and that, to me...
Washed it all.
Ended up dominating it, shall we say, and like my friends were in groups, some of them like Stones, your Beatles or your Stones, and some of them played bluesy kind of like... Born in Chicago, like, I forget the name, Paul Butterfield Blues Band, and some of them are like Beatles cover songs. So... And again, there was 3 or 4 at least different groups that formed of people I knew in high school. Let's get a band. Let's start to play. Inspired by the Beatles.
So you're saying West Island or Pointe-Claire, Lakeshore, around 64, 65, 66, there started to be an explosion of bands.
My memory is of what I was familiar with was local high school bands, let's say, not the ones more successful that we used to go and see at the Bonaventure Curling Club on like JB and the Playboys and Staccatos from Ottawa and stuff, and MG and the Escorts. And like the Edgewater Hotel had a disco down below in the, whatever it was called, in the 70s. They had the Maples Inn, where we all kind of hung out. They had bands, they had professional bands came there. Levon Helm played there from the band. And so in the late 60s, early 70s, the Edgewater there, the Pointe-Claire Hotel, the Pioneer, the Clydes, all the different variations of it. Those were the, in my opinion, or my memory, those are the venues where professional acts who were well known and were touring Canada playing, that's where they would play. My friends, our bands, we played unprofessionally in local high schools or church basements and stuff.
But there was definitely
a scene. It was a scene, yeah.
A scene, because now it's been attributed to the emergence of garage rock, because it was a little raw.
Yeah.
It was a little disconnected. It wasn't perfect.
It wasn't as professional. Well,
it wasn't as professional, but it developed the style.
The term garage band.
It became very appealing.
There's some music back then. A few groups I consider them garage band because they had a rougher sound. And then in the early '90s, you got the Seattle Nirvana and Pearl Jam and stuff. That's when grunge or that kind of music to me went a different level.
It went commercial.
A similar kind of.
It's like when punk went commercial.
Yeah, not as polished. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, second new wave in the late '70s from England, like Elvis Costello and Nick Lowe and those guys. To me, that and the Sex Pistols and
Joe Jackson.
Yeah, they were kind of a second wave of the second British invasion, but a different kind of music, a more rough and raw and in your face.
There's so much going on. I mean, we can have a whole conversation
Yeah.
about even so. If you look at it from like a macro level, just that era, you have, let's say the Clash and the Pistols,
Yeah,
but then you also have the Stranglers,
yeah,
who were very different.
yeah.
And then you also have a little later on the Cure, who again was very different.
The 80s, yeah, there's a different,
You know,
the Cure, the Jam, all those kind of groups.
The Cure and the Jam, which were, because you had power pop,
Yeah,
which was like a polished kind of punk, but it was not. I don't think it wasn't influenced from the Pistols. It's influenced from the Kinks, like early Kinks and the Small Faces. Like they were trying to go back to that original '60s rock pop of those bands, and it's never ending. And plus, you have the emergence of ska, and it's never ending, man.
Well, I think about the 70s, to me, there was a lot of different kind of music that all succeeded and coexisted. Like you had still pop records, traditional. You had Elton John was big in the 70s, the Eagles, different style.
Mm-hmm.
You had the British stuff, the Clash, disco.
Supertramp.
Yeah, mellow, all the John Denver, everything was successful. And there was enough room, space, whatever, for them all to be successful. That particular, when I think about the 70s, in that regard, to me, looking back now, that was more proliferation than the 60s. And then in the 80s, again, you had the synth, all the British stuff, and
in the early
but the
80s,
70s, when I think about it, now there was 5 or 6 different styles of music, more than any other decade. Maybe that's what I'm trying to say.
Oh, absolutely.
For whatever reason, it just happened.
At a pioneer level too.
Yeah.
At a pioneer level.
Yeah.
Big time. Because I would say like the 90s might be one of the last decades where there was some originality of some music that was unique to a decade.
Yeah.
Because the 80s had synth, but then you listen to some old Talking Heads stuff, and 1977 Talking Heads sounds like
they were an American
83.
equivalent of the class of like Elvis Costello and the Stranglers and all, or the Clash and everything similar.
And you go back and you have the New York Dolls.
Yeah. Yeah.
Who were doing Pistols type stuff.
And glam rock almost
before,
in a way. Yeah.
But they were doing like maybe what they saw what Mark Bolan was doing. It was like a combination of Keith Richards and Mark Bolan.
Ziggy Stardust and Bowie. I mean.
Yeah, all like meshed
and the
together.
70s also had stuff like Barry White, and they had ABBA, and it was all successful. Like totally different kinds of music.
You had deep funk, and you had Bob Marley.
And in the early 70s, you had what they call prog rock, the British groups like Yes and King Crimson, and that were in Genesis that were. Actually, Quebec was one of the biggest markets in North America.
Yes,
some of those groups,
wasn't it?
I remember literally.
Huge with the French population.
I know that touring in the year 70s, some of those bands like Supertramp, Yes, Krista Berg, he's a single, but they would, when they toured North America, they would do maybe 2 sellout shows at the Forum, and when they went to Rochester, they were playing a theater or something, because Montreal was a bigger market.
Did you get into the early Genesis things?
Not a lot. I liked a few songs here and there, but it wasn't. All the ponderous, I found a lot of it too ponderous and
it's a commitment.
Yeah, just I'm still more of I like melody and harmony and pop and music is my first love. I like other styles, but so that all the Genesis and the Yes and that, I liked a few songs, but it wasn't like.
So you must have been a big Beach Boys.
Beach Boys? Oh yeah, I saw them a few times. I worked a few of their shows later on.
Beach Boys is a band that's, I would say, is underestimated as a band.
Yeah.
Not overestimated as a singles band, but underestimated as an album band. Like Holland and 2020, Friends. It's the 67 to 73
Well, Brian Wilson,
era.
if you know them, he was basically the genius.
He was just
he wrote
sitting there
everything.
just writing stuff.
And
they would come back from the tour and be like, what the hell is this?
Yeah, and a lot of their early, some of the biggest songs, I've learned that it isn't the other Beach Boys playing on it. They're singing those harmonies. But like the Pet Sounds album and Good Vibrations, there's a group of West Coast musicians called the Session. They're known as the Wrecking Crew.
Oh yeah.
Who were studio.
What's her name on bass?
I know the one.
You know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, Carol Hayes or something, or
She did Good Vibrations, I think.
And the drummer, a guy named Hal Blaine, is legendary. He played on. In fact, there's videos of the Beach Boys in the studio doing that album, and there's Hal Blaine. Not that Dennis Wilson, he played on tour, let's say, but so Brian Wilson was the genius, and those particular period, the production and the musicians are a mixture of the Beach Boys and these great session guys.
That's why those albums are like, you won't, what hits do they have on those albums? On Holland they have...
That's in the early 70s. That was when...
With that other singer, there was that other Beach Boy guy with the curly hair.
Yes, Blondie Chaplin.
Yeah, he sang a hit.
Elon Sailor?
Yes. So there was that, there was Forever.
Yeah, at that point they were to me at that point the Beach Boys, they were changing, trying to keep up with the changing.
Yeah.
Because I know I've read some of their story, and their father, the Wilson father, was a Freudian maniac. They could never please him, and Brian, I think it affected his father could never...
They fired him around that time.
Yeah, but as good as they were and as brilliant as Brian was in success, it was never enough for the father. He always found criticism. That's what I remember. And the other thing I remember is about 1968 or 69, when the whole surfing beach sound was passé and it was all psychedelic, their father had kind of determined, you know what, it's over. He sold their entire publishing catalog for a lump sum fee of like $750,000, and against Brian was almost in tears, like, don't do it. But his father, so they lost the songwriting because he thought it's over. Well, it wasn't over, but at the time it was like no one wants to listen to this surf cars songs anymore. It's all about psychedelics and shit. So their father apparently, that's it. I'm going to cash out now, sell the entire publishing, and that's where money is in music business. If you own song publishing and written songs and own the publishing rights and royalties, that's a money tree forever.
The Eagles, Don
Henley?
Don Henley. I think he owned the publishing rights to Hotel California from the beginning. Well, John Fogerty learned a lesson there.
Yeah, it's just recently he's finally got his songs back. Yeah, that's that's one of, there's a lot of stories in the music industry over years. Yeah.
Another story?
A lot of, Buddy Holly, his producer was a guy named Norman Petty out of a little studio in New Mexico. Anyway, my understanding is Petty over time, he added his name as a songwriting credit on a lot of Buddy Holly songs. So it'd be like Hardin, which was his real name, Petty, Buddy Holly, Norman Petty. So cha-ching, he gets, and he was controlling a lot of Buddy's finances, and they started to spar over it. And before Buddy Holly died, he was living in New York City. He had married a Mexican-American woman. He was living in New York City in Greenwich Village, expanding his musical horizons. He was doing stuff with King Curtis, playing saxophone on his song. He had strings on his songs. He was expanding, but he was cash-strapped. And near the end, because Norman Petty was holding the purse strings, so he got a job offer after Christmas in 1959 to go out on a rock and roll tour through the Midwest in the dead of winter. And he died out there in the plane crash. So, in my opinion, Norman Petty is almost responsible for his death indirectly. So that's just one story of how the management people behind the booth and in
at least
the
the
lawyers.
Publishing is in good hands now.
Yeah, it's all
Paul McCartney. Yeah?
Oh, well, for him,
who has Buddy Holly's catalog.
Oh yeah, he bought it. That's right. He also bought. I think he owns a lot of stuff. He owns.
What's his name? Summertime Blues.
Eddie Cochran?
Eddie Cochran.
I don't know, as far as I know, he owns a chorus line, the Broadway musical rights.
Really?
Like he needs the extra money, but he's a businessman.
Paul McCartney?
He owns a chorus line, he owns the Buddy Holly catalog, I believe, most of it.
Yeah, because when they did the Buddy Holly story, he came out with a documentary called The Real Buddy Holly Story.
Yeah.
And he owned
He used to have an annual party in London on Buddy Holly's anniversary of his death, and that's the party one year when Keith Moon, the drummer for the Who, was there, and the next morning they found him dead in his home because he basically drank himself to death.
God.
Anyway,
there's a good line from Pete Townsend saying, all you guys, you talk about this artist and that artist and this and they died and that died. He's like, you have to understand, these guys were my friends.
Yeah.
They were all my friends.
Yeah, your colleagues.
And now they're all gone.
Yeah.
We're just talking about them like they're this and that. I knew we were going to spiral off of on something else. That's why I wrote questions here to keep me on track. Priest Farm actually is here. Okay, you mentioned to me, we had a conversation about, it was on the cover of, I believe, one of the Dave Boxer
hit
lists.
Yeah.
That it was a guy on a skateboard.
Yeah, I have that.
So in your memory, this is the first time you're seeing.
That was the spring of
skateboard.
'65. That, to me, that's my memory. That was the year. That was the big fad. Like in 1958, there was the hula hoop came out, and we all had hula hoops.
Yeah, the hula hoop competition.
Yeah.
And the
Doing this in your driveway and shit.
Yeah.
So my memories, and I guess there had been skateboards before that, but in early '65 is when skateboards hit the West Island at least, and we all had our skateboards. And Aurora Hill down, Aurora, where it goes down, that's where we would go. And the original skateboards we had, the wheels were like harder rubber. There was no like little shock absorbers. They were, if you hit a little pebble, you're wiped out, you know.
So it was stiff. The whole thing was
Yeah,
stiff.
it was a board and two wheels in the front, two in the back, but they were stiff and they weren't directional, and it was a harder rubber, so they didn't absorb little pebbles. So it was.
So you couldn't lean this way or that way at the time?
No, not on the board, as I remember. So, yeah, I've still got that. So that spring, a couple of 2 or 3 weeks in a row of his weekly hit chart, on the cover is a guy on a skateboard, like doing the hang 10 or something. So that was.
And to your memory, that's when you caught wind of this craze.
Yeah.
And then
it was that year.
Who would have been selling skateboards at the time in the West Island?
Yeah, which retail store? Eh? That's a good. I have no memory. Well, Dorval Gardens had, back then they had a Morgan store.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, when Fairview opened, Fairview hadn't opened. This was summer of '65. Fairview opened in August '65, so I wouldn't have bought them at Fairview because I would have had them.
Some good research right there that you just did.
Yeah.
So it may have been Dorval.
Yeah, the Morgans, maybe the Pointe-Claire Village. I don't know. That's a good. Well, somewhere here probably sold them. Maybe the Woolworths. They probably had a little sporting goods department, or.
Is that the kind of store that they were? If there was a toy that was trending at the time, Ted's wouldn't have had a skateboard.
Ask what's his name if he's still. I don't know.
Oh, maybe he would know actually.
Yeah, because Ted's
Pratt.
Hobbies, they had other stuff. I used to build the model cars, buy them there, and glue them together and stuff.
So you were a group of friends and you all had your skateboards, and that was the hot thing that summer.
I just remember that one summer. Yeah, for me, I remember we all got a lot of us got skateboards, and that was the hill that we'd go over, because it was a hill and it wasn't on a main drag. You couldn't do it on St. John's Road. You'd get roadkill, you know. So
was it? Did you use it just for that, or was it also transportation?
Yeah, maybe a little bit of transportation, but you put one leg up and you kind of like do this. I still see, well, there's kids now, but they have the motorized boards. I see them once in a while. Yeah. Different, not the same.
Hoverboards.
Yeah. So
I think a popular move at that time was, there's some footage of that. It's mostly groundwork. Like there was no bowls or anything yet at that point.
No, it's true. None
so
of this.
It's all parking lot stuff, and a lot of it was like switch footing, like
jumping and.
Yeah, then your board does like a 180 type of thing.
Yeah. Flipping the back up, maybe,
or putting the back up and then doing a spin or something like that.
That probably happened. I just remember having one, and it was a big deal for that one summer, pretty much.
Okay, well, here's the $64,000 question. When did your patience run out, and when did you stop skateboarding?
Probably that summer. I'm just, again, I can't remember sure, but I'm guessing it was a one summer, and I was getting older, so at some point you think, oh, that's, I'm too old for that, or too passé, you know.
You do know that skateboarding in the 80s was huge in the West Island.
Yeah.
And then particularly in the 90s, it was massive in the West Island.
My sons had skateboards.
In
the late 90s, I'll call it.
Yeah. It was huge.
Yeah.
And never for a second you thought that you may have been a part of the first skateboard crew of the West Island?
Well, I never
Is that too much
thought
of
of
a
it that way.
prestigious thing
Oh yeah,
to consider?
I'll take that. Thank you very much. I don't know. But I don't think I think they started out in California, like, you know, the surfing. It's very
but I mean, you can claim it for the lakeshore.
That's my memory is, and again, Dave Boxer, all the hit lists over the years. There was different things, like then next '67, a bunch of his covers for a few weeks was Expo '67, you know, opening up, and so it was a topical. So that was early '65 is when the skateboarding exploded here, I'll call it.
So this might be a little bit too much of a deep dive question, but of course, when you were a skateboarder in the 80s or the 90s, there was a certain kind of dress and a certain kind of music that was associated that just helped elevate the genre that you represented. Was there anything like that in your day that was like, if you're doing this activity, then this is the kind of music that goes along with that activity?
No, I don't remember. Skateboarding, when I did it, I don't remember any special clothes. Like, it was just whatever we were wearing, jeans and
some Converse.
no special music.
And some
I think there was a few, maybe Jan and Dean had a couple like skateboard songs on the radio, you know. But that's all I can think of. But no, I don't remember any of our gang having to wear the same de rigueur costume. No, go home. You're not. Go home and change.
Yeah. So how long did it last in your memory? Like a year, and then.
Well, maybe for me, in my case.
Yeah,
I'm a. Yeah.
You're a unique case.
It probably lasted longer. It probably lasted for years. I mean, I don't think it's ever maybe gone away. Like you said, 80s, 90s. And that's the year I remember that. And for me, I don't think I did it after 65. Maybe I did, but I don't remember.
But for the most part, transportation was on the bike.
Yeah.
And what would be like your what would have been too far, and how far were you going on a daily basis, like roughly, you know?
It would have been from the Cedar Park area, I'll call it, down the Priest Farm, up to, in high school, I met some kids from, it's called Elm Park. It's just past Fairview. Where McDonald's is there, there was that was the first little development on the west side of Dollard, yeah. So I knew, and those kids went to, well, the Protestant ones went to John Rennie, so that's where I met a whole new group of, and one of my best friends lived up in there, a couple of them. So for me, in my high school years, before I got a license, I didn't ride my bike, I walked. We walked. I'd walk.
From your house?
Yeah. I never hitchhiked. Some people hitchhike, that they have stories.
Hitchhiked?
I was too, oh yeah, I know girls and stuff who hitchhiked up and down St. John's, and guys, I was too much of a wimp, whatever you call it. I never hitchhiked, literally, in those days, so I walked.
Wait a minute, hitchhiking was a big deal for people who needed to get from the lakeshore up to...
Or people going downtown along the 20. I have high school friends. Once in a while people will talk about it on Facebook. Oh yeah, we hitchhiked from A to B, or the Mapes, or along downtown. And teenage girls, you kind of shudder to think,
It's illegal now.
Yeah, you can't be on a major, it's illegal.
Now it's illegal.
But common sense, it's like anything, you risk in this day and age. But even back then...
Back then too, it just wasn't reported as much.
Yeah, probably, sure. But...
Well,
so in my case, I walked until I got a license, up until the age of 18. My friends in Lakeside Heights, I had a bunch of guys that lived around this area, so on weekends we'd walk everywhere. We didn't have a car, and this one buddy up in Elm Park there, we'd go to Fairview on a Friday night. That Fairview became the big weekend. It's indoors in the winter, you can hang out. And when we go home for the night, I'd just walk right down St. John's Road to Bathurst. It might have been 20 below, whatever. Didn't think about it, just that's what we did.
Where did you hang out in Fairview? Just on the benches or something?
Yeah, pretty much.
By the statue, or?
I'd say the benches. You go browse in stores. Eaton's, I bought a couple of records. Eaton's had a record department. I'd flip through there.
Well, that's what happened with Ted's Records and Hobbies. They couldn't compete.
Yeah, once Fairview, that's true. And the Bay or Morgan's would have had one. And there was a Simpsons, actually. There was the three big department stores at the time. And there was a store called Brasso Records. It was right at the by the main center part.
Was there a toy store? Do you remember there being a toy store?
I don't remember specifically. I'm guessing there would have been.
So the toys would have been like in Woolworths in that toy section, or
a section. Oh, I'm sure the department stores had toy sections.
Yeah.
But a separate toy store on its own, I don't know. I didn't bring it, but I have a picture on a folder of a Fairview diagram from 1960 when it opened, one or two, and I think one of them might have a listing of stores. I don't know.
Oh yeah, you're right.
So
yeah, you're right.
We hung around in. I just wrote this recently on one of the Facebook groups. I got busted for shoplifting when Fairview opened. I went in. This is before barcodes and before scanners and anything, and I was starting to copy the Beatles. One of my things was their clothes. They wore button-down Oxford cloth. I didn't wear a suit. Well, we had to wear a uniform at John Rennie, but. So I went into Fairview, Eaton Simpsons one time, early after it opened, and I think I might have gone to pay for it, and it was a lineup, so I just stuck it in my jacket and walked out, and I sat on by the fountain there. Next thing I know, I'm grabbed from behind and taken back into an office and got a shakedown by, he said, you can do two things here. You can call your parents now and tell them what you've done, or we'll call them and tell them.
Oh,
and I'm so I don't know. Anyway,
like, is there a third option that doesn't involve my parents?
We talked. Whatever happened, he finally, I guess he scared me. He finally said, "Okay, we'll let you go, but you just think about what you've done, and maybe you should tell your parents yourself and just reconsider, kind of. So I didn't get, and I was like 16, you know, stupid. And it's the only time I ever shoplifted that I can remember, you know. So, but it was like sitting by that fountain at Fairview there, and I get kind of, and they obviously saw me, and they just, let's go into the back.
Simpsons, you said?
Yeah, it was Simpsons at the time.
Terrifying.
Was it Simpsons or the Bay? Morgan's. It was Morgan. I think it was a Simpsons. I think I could look on that thing at home. I think Eaton's was always at the West End.
Yeah.
And I think Simpsons was at the East End originally.
Simpsons was at the East End.
And then Simpsons maybe left or moved, and that's when Morgan's would have.
Or the Bay.
Well, Morgan's became the Bay. It was called Morgan's at the time.
Yeah, and then it was the Bay.
Yeah, it's still there
And
somehow.
Then Sears.
And Sears, I think Sears took over Eaton's when it left.
Oh, you're right, because Sears opened
and then
up.
Sears moved to the middle where they built a new, out where the keg is now. You know, there's been different.
No, it's where Winners is. The Winners, what's it called? Sports Experts.
Yes.
That thing.
Down there, yeah.
All that was Sears.
Yeah.
That's 1990.
Home Sense,
90,
whatever.
91, 92,
Yeah.
93.
I got interviewed actually summer of 2015. It was the 50th anniversary of Fairview. And I got interviewed, I don't know how it came, I got interviewed at Fairview by someone from Global News, because I was one of the people who'd been there on the opening day. And I can't find it on YouTube. They did a little clip it, and I don't know whether I think I was on TV. You know, they gave me like a 3 or 4 minute interview, and then of course for the nightly news, they chop it down to about 20 seconds or something.
Much like what I'm going to do here.
There you go. Yeah. I hope there's something left of worth.